oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no rights. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come brothers and sisters, while the struggle carries on, the Internationale unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international in our world, poisoned by exploitation, those who have taken, they must give, and then the vanity of nations, we hope one earth on which to live. So the brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama, in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbound before their armor, we defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their aggression, let us be inspired by life and love. Although they offer us concessions, change will not come from above. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The
Okay. Looks like it's working now. Thanks. Shit's driving me nuts, man. I'm trying to get this. Wi-Fi ain't liking me. It is not liking me at all. Just gonna check the obstruction map. I am connected. Let's. Okay. Welcome. Be working now. Just thought I'd play that song. Talk about convenient timing, it just shuts off at that point. Jeez. Alright. So I'll just have this stream going right next to me so I can see it. Okay, it's working. Alright, good. Hopefully it stays working, otherwise I'm gonna fucking flip. Okay, might as well just get straight into it and I'll explain everything at the end. Vladimir Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Let's go. Prefaces. Here we go. Preface to the Russian edition. The pamphlet here presented to the reader was written in Zurich in the spring of 1916. In the conditions in which I was obliged to work there, I naturally suffered somewhat from a shortage of French and English literature and from a serious dearth of Russian literature. However, I made use of the principal English work, Imperialism, J.A. Hobson's book, with all the care that, in my opinion, that work deserves. This pamphlet was written with an eye to Tsarist censorship. Hence, I was not only forced to confine myself strictly to an exclusively theoretical, mainly economic analysis of facts, but to formulate the few necessary observations on politics with extreme caution, by hints in that Aesopian language, in that cursed Aesopian language, to which Tsarism compelled all revolutionaries to have recourse whenever they took up their pens to write a legal work. It is very painful, in these days of liberty, to read these cramped passages of the pamphlet, crushed as they seem in an iron vice, distorted on account of the censor, of how imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution, of how social chauvinism, socialism in words, chauvinism in deeds, is the utter betrayal of socialism, complete desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie, of how the split in the labour movement is bound up with the objective conditions of imperialism, etc. I had to speak in a slavish tongue, and I must refer the reader who is interested in the question to the volume which is soon to appear, in which I reproduce the articles I wrote abroad in the years 1914 to 17. Special attention must be drawn, however, to a passage on page 154. In order to show, in a guise acceptable to the censors, how shamefully the capitalists and the social chauvinist deserters, whom Kautsky opposes with so much inconsistency, lie on the question of annexations, in order to show with what cynicism they screen the annexations of their capitalists, I was forced to quote as an example Japan. The careful reader will easily substitute Russia for Japan, and Finland, Poland, Courland, the Ukraine, Khiva, Bokhara, Estonia, or other regions peopled by non-Great Russians for Korea. I trust that this pamphlet will help the reader to understand the fundamental economic question, viz., the question of the economic essence of imperialism. For unless this is studied, it will be impossible to understand and appraise modern war and modern politics. Then has a preface to the French and German editions. As was indicated in the preface to the Russian edition, this pamphlet was written in 1916 with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. I am unable to revise the whole text at the present time, nor, perhaps, is this advisable, since the main purpose of the book was, and remains, to present, on the basis of the summarized returns of irrefutable bourgeois statistics and the admissions of bourgeois scholars of all countries, a general picture of the world capitalist system and its international relationships at the beginning of the 20th century, on the eve of the First World Imperialist War. He's talking about World War I. To a certain extent, it will be useful for many communists and advanced capitalist countries to convince themselves by the example of this pamphlet, legal from the standpoint of the Tsarist censor, of the possibility and necessity of making use of even the slight remnants of legality which still remain at the disposal of the communists, say, in contemporary America or France, after the recent wholesale arrests of communists, in order to explain the utter falsity of social pacifist views and hopes for world democracy. The most essential of what should be added to this censored pamphlet I shall try to present in this preface. In the pamphlet, I proved that the war of 1914 to 18 was imperialistic, that is, annexationist, predatory, plunderous war on the part of both sides. It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition, repartition of colonies, spheres of influence of finance capital, etc. Proof of what was the true social, or rather the true class character of them, is naturally to be found, not in the diplomatic history of the war, but in an analysis of the objective position of the ruling classes in all belligerent countries. In order to depict this objective position, one must not take examples, isolated data. In view of the extreme complexity of social life, it is always quite easy to select any number of examples or separate data to prove any point one desires. But the whole of the data concerning the basis of economic life in all the belligerent countries and the whole world. It is precisely irrefutable summarized data of this kind that I quoted in describing the partition of the world in the period of 1876 to 1914 in Chapter 6, and the distribution of the railways all over the world in the period of 1890 to 1913 in Chapter 7. Railways combine within themselves the basic capitalist industries, coal, iron, and steel, and they are the most striking index of the development of international trade and bourgeois democratic civilization. In the preceding chapters of the book, I showed how the railways are linked up with large-scale industry, with monopolies, syndicates, cartels, trusts, banks, and the financial oligarchy. The uneven distribution of the railways, their uneven development, sums up, as it were, modern world monopolist capitalism. And this summing up proves that imperialist wars are absolutely inevitable under such an economic system as long as private property in the means of production exists. The building of railways seems to be a simple, natural, democratic, cultural, and civilizing enterprise. That is what it is in the opinion of bourgeois professors, who are paid to depict capitalist slavery in bright colours, and in the opinion of petty bourgeois Philistines. But as a matter of fact, the capitalist threads, which in thousands of different intercrossings bind these enterprises, with private property and the means of production in general, have converted this work of construction into an instrument for oppressing 1,000 million people in the colonies and semi-colonies, that is, more than half the population of the globe, which inhabits the subject countries, as well as the wage slaves of capitalism in the lands of civilization. Private property based on the labor of the small proprietor, free competition, democracy, i.e., all the catchwords with which the capitalists and their press deceive the workers and the peasants, are things of the past. Capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the people of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world marauders armed to the teeth: America, Great Britain, Japan, who involve the whole world in their war over the sharing of their booty. The Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, dictated by monarchist Germany, and later on the much more brutal and despicable Versailles Treaty, dictated by the democratic republics of America and France, and also by Free England, have rendered very good service to humanity by exposing both the hired coolies of the pen of imperialism and the petty bourgeois reactionaries, although they call themselves pacifists and socialists, who sang praises to Wilsonism and who insisted that peace and reform were possible under imperialism. The tens of millions of dead and maimed left by the war, a war for the purpose of deciding whether the British or German group of financial marauders is to receive the lion's share, and the 2 peace treaties mentioned above, open the eyes of the millions and tens of millions of people who are downtrodden, pressed, deceived, and duped by the bourgeoisie with unprecedented rapidity. Thus, out of the universal ruin caused by the war, a worldwide revolutionary crisis is arising, which, in spite of the protracted and difficult stages it may have to pass, cannot end in any other way than in a proletarian revolution and in its victory. The Basler Manifesto, the Second International, which in 1912 gave an appraisal of the war that ultimately broke out in 1914, and not of war in general. There are all kinds of wars, including revolutionary wars. This manifesto is now a monument exposing the shameful bankruptcy and treachery of the heroes of the Second International. This is why I produced this manifesto as a supplement to the present edition, and again I call upon the reader to note that the heroes of the Second International are just as assiduously avoiding the passages of this manifesto, which speak precisely, clearly, and definitely of the connection between that impending war and the proletarian revolution, as a thief avoids the place where he has committed a theft. Special attention has been devoted in this pamphlet to a criticism of Kautskyism, the international ideological trend presented in all countries of the world by the prominent theoreticians and leaders of the Second International. Otto Bauer and Co. in Austria, Ramsay MacDonald and others in England, Albert Thomas in France, etc., etc., and multitudes of socialists, reformists, pacifists, bourgeois democrats, and parsons. This ideological trend is, on the one hand, a product of the disintegration and decay of the Second International, and, on the other hand, it is the inevitable fruit of the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, who, by the whole of their conditions of life, are held captive to bourgeois and democratic prejudices. The views held by Kautsky and his like are a complete renunciation of the very revolutionary principles of Marxism, which he championed for decades, especially in his struggle against socialist opportunism. Bernstein, Millerand, Hindemann, Gompers, etc. It is not a mere accident, therefore, that the Kautskyians all over the world are now united in practical politics with the extreme opportunists through the Second or the Yellow International, and with the bourgeois governments through bourgeois coalition governments in which socialists take part. The growing world proletarian revolutionary movement in general, and the communist movement in particular, demands that the theoretical errors of Kautskyism be analyzed and exposed. the more so since pacifism and democracy in general, which have no claim to Marxism whatever, which, like Kautsky and co., are obscuring the profundity of the contradictions of imperialism and the inevitable revolutionary crisis to which it gives rise, are still very widespread over the world. It is the bounden duty of the party of the proletariat to combat these tendencies and to win away from the bourgeoisie the small proprietors who are duped by them, and the millions of toilers who live in more or less petty bourgeois conditions of life. Few words must be said about Chapter 8, entitled The Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism. As already pointed out in the text, Hilferding, ex-Marxist and now a comrade-in-arms of Kautsky, one of the chief exponents of bourgeois reformist policy in the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, has taken a step backward compared with the frankly pacifist and reformist Englishman Hobson on this question. The international split of the whole labour movement is now quite evident. Second and third internationals. Armed struggle and civil war between the two trends is now a recognised fact. The support given to Kolchak and Denikin in Russia by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries against the Bolsheviks, the fight the Schiedemans, Nosks and co. have conducted in conjunction with the bourgeoisie against the Spartacists in Germany, the same thing in Finland, Poland, Hungary, etc. What is the economic basis of this historically important world phenomenon? Precisely the parasitism, decay of capitalism, which are the characteristic features of its highest historical stage of development, i.e., imperialism. As has been shown in this pamphlet, capitalism has now brought to the front a handful, less than 1/10 of the inhabitants of the globe, less than 1/5 if the most generous and liberal calculations are made, of very rich and very powerful states which plunder the whole world simply by clipping coupons. Capital exports produce an income of 8 to 10 billion francs per annum, according to pre-war prices and pre-war bourgeois statistics. Now, of course, they produce much more than that. Obviously, out of such enormous super profits, since they are obtained over and above the profits which capitalists squeeze out of the workers of their home country, it is quite possible to bribe the labour leaders and the upper stratum of the labour aristocracy. And the capitalists of the advanced countries are bribing them. They bribe them in 1,000 different ways, direct and indirect, overt and covert. This stratum of bourgeoisified workers, or the labour aristocracy, who are quite Philistine in their mode of life, in the size of their earnings, and in their outlook, serves as the principal prop of the Second International, and, in our days, the principal social, not military, prop of the bourgeoisie. They are the real agents of the bourgeoisie labour movement, the labour lieutenants of the capitalist class, real channels of reformism and chauvinism. In the civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, they inevitably, and in no small numbers, stand side by side with the bourgeoisie, with the Versaillais against the communards. Not the slightest progress can be made toward the solution of the practical problems of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and unless its political and sociological significance is appreciated. Imperialism is the eve of the proletarian social revolution. This has been confirmed since 1917 on a worldwide scale. Lenin July 6th, 1920. Okay, and so we go on. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. During the last 15 or 20 years, especially since the Spanish-American 1898 and the Anglo-Boer War 1899 to 1902, the economic and also the political literature of the two hemispheres has more and more often adopted the term imperialism in order to define the present era. In 1902, a book by the English economist J.A. Hobson, Imperialism, was published in London and New York. This author, who adopts the point of view of bourgeois social reformism and pacifism, which, in essence, is identical with the present point of view of the ex-Marxist Karl Kautsky, gives an excellent and comprehensive description of the principal economic and political characteristics of imperialism. In 1910, there appeared in Vienna the work of the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hilferding, Finance Capital. In spite of the mistake the author commits on the theory of money, and in spite of a certain inclination on his part to reconcile Marxism with opportunism, this work gives a very valuable theoretical analysis, as its subtitle tells us, of the latest phase of capitalist development. Indeed, what has been said of imperialism during the last few years, especially in a great many magazine and newspaper articles, and also in the resolutions, for example, of the Chemnitz and Basel Congresses, which took place in the autumn of 1912, has scarcely gone beyond the ideas put forward, or, more exactly, summed up by the two writers mentioned above. Later on, we shall try to show briefly, and as simply as possible, the connection and relationships between the principal economic features of imperialism. We shall not be able to deal with non-economic aspects of the question, however much they deserve to be dealt with. We have put references to literature and other notes which perhaps would not interest all readers at the end of this pamphlet. These references are not given in this edition. Now we really get into it. Chapter 1. Concentration of production and monopolies. The enormous growth of industry, the remarkably rapid process of concentration of production in ever larger enterprises represent one of the most characteristic features of capitalism. Modern censuses of production give very complete and exact data on this process. In Germany, for example, for every 1,000 industrial enterprises, large enterprises, i.e., those employing more than 50 workers, numbered 3 in 1882, 6 in 1895, and 9 in 1907, and out of every 100 workers employed, this group of enterprises employed 22, 30, and 37 respectively. Concentration of production, however, is much more intense than the concentration of workers, since labour in the large enterprises is much more productive. This is shown by the figures available on steam engines and electric motors. If we take what in Germany is called industry in the broad sense of the term, that is, including commerce, transport, etc., we get the following picture. Large-scale enterprises, 30,588 out of a total of 3,265,623, that is to say, 0.9%. These large-scale enterprises employ 5,700,000 workers out of a total of 14,400,000. That is 39.4%. They use 6,660,000 steam horsepower out of a total of 8,800,000. That is 75.3%. And 1,200,000 kilowatts of electricity out of a total of 1,500,000. That is 77.2%. Obviously, he's using outdated data here. This is not applicable to the modern day. In fact, it's worse. It's worse today. Far worse. A lot worse. Less than 1/100th of the total enterprises utilize more than 3/4 of the steam and electric power. 2,970,000 small enterprises employing up to 5 workers, representing 91% of the total, utilize only 7% of the steam and electric power. Tens of thousands of large-scale enterprises are everything. Millions of small ones, nothing. In 1907, there were in Germany 586 establishments employing 1,000 and more workers. They employed nearly 1/10, 1,380,000, of the total number of workers employed in industry and utilized almost 1/3, 32%, of the total steam and electric power employed. As we shall see, money capital and the banks made this superiority of a handful of the largest enterprises still more overwhelming, in the most literal sense of the word, since millions of small, medium, and even some big masters are in fact in complete subjection to some hundreds of millionaire financiers. In another advanced country of modern capitalism, the United States, the growth of the concentration of production is still greater. Here, statistics single out industry in the narrow sense of the word and group enterprises according to the value of their annual output. In 1904, large-scale enterprises with an annual output of $1 million and over numbered 1,900 out of 216,180, i.e. 0.9%. These employed 1,400,000 workers out of 5,500,000, i.e. 25.6%, and their combined annual output was valued at $5,600,000,000 out of $14,800,000,000, i.e. 38%. 5 years later, in 1909, the corresponding figures were large-scale enterprises, 3,060 out of 268,491, i.e. 1.1%, employing 2 million workers out of 6,600,000, i.e. 30.5%, output 9 billion out of 20,700,000,000, i.e. 43.8%. Almost half the total production of all the enterprises of the country was carried on by 1/100th part of those enterprises. Those 3,000 giant enterprises embrace 268 branches of industry. From this, it can be seen that, at a certain stage of its development, concentration itself, as it were, leads right to monopoly. For a score or so of giant enterprises can easily arrive at an agreement, while, on the other hand, the difficulty of competition and the tendency towards monopoly rise from the very dimensions of the enterprises. This transformation of competition into monopoly is one of the most important, if not the most important, phenomena of modern capitalist economy, and we must deal with it in greater detail. But first, we must clear up one possible misunderstanding. American statistics say 3,000 giant enterprises in 250 branches of industry, as if there were only a dozen large-scale enterprises for each branch of industry. But this is not the case. Not in every branch of industry are there large-scale enterprises. And, moreover, a very important feature of capitalism, its highest stage of development, is so-called combined production. That is to say, the grouping in a single enterprise of different branches of industry, which either represent the consecutive stages in the working up of raw materials. For example, the smelting of iron ore into pig iron, the conversion of pig iron into steel, and then perhaps the manufacture of steel goods, or are auxiliary to one another. For example, the utilization of waste or of byproducts, the manufacture of packing materials, etc. Combination, writes Hilferding, levels out the fluctuations of trade and therefore assures to the combined enterprises a more stable rate of profit. Secondly, combination has the effect of eliminating trading. Thirdly, it has the effect of rendering possible technical improvements and, consequently, the acquisition of super profits over and above those obtained by the pure, i.e., non-combined enterprises. Fourthly, it strengthens the position of the combined enterprises compared with that of pure enterprises in the competitive struggle in periods of serious depression. When the fall in prices of raw materials does not keep pace with the fall in prices of manufactured articles. The German bourgeois economist Hayman, who has written a book especially on mixed, that is, combined enterprises in the German iron industry, says, pure enterprises perish, crushed between the high price of raw material and the low price of the finished product. Thus we get the following picture. There remain, on the one hand, the great coal companies, producing millions of tons yearly, strongly organized in their coal syndicate, and, on the other, the great steel works, closely allied to the coal mines, having their own steel syndicate. These giant enterprises, producing 400,000 tons of steel per annum, with correspondingly extensive coal, ore, and blast furnace plants, as well as the manufacturing of finished goods, employing 10,000 workers quartered in company houses, sometimes owning their own ports and railroads, are today the standard type of German iron and steel plant. And concentration still continues. Individual enterprises are becoming larger and larger. An ever-increasing number of enterprises in one given industry, or in several different industries, join together in giant combines, backed up and controlled by half a dozen Berlin banks. In the German mining industry, the truth of the teachings of Karl Marx, concentration, is definitely proved, at any rate in a country like ours, where it is protected by tariffs and freight rates. The German mining industry is ripe for expropriation. Such is the conclusion, which a conscientious bourgeois. It must be noted that he seems to place Germany in a special category because her industries are protected by high tariffs. But the concentration of industry and the formation of monopolist manufacturers' combines, cartels, syndicates, etc., could only be accelerated by these circumstances. It is extremely important to note that in free trade England, concentration also leads to monopoly, although somewhat later and perhaps in another form. Professor Herman Levy, in his special work of research entitled Monopolies, Cartels and Trusts, based on data on British economic development, writes as follows. In Great Britain, it is the size of the enterprise and its capacity which harbour a monopolist tendency. This, for one thing, is due to the fact that the great investment of capital per enterprise, once the concentration movement is commenced, gives rise to increasing demands for new capital for the new enterprises, and thereby renders their launching more difficult. Moreover, and this seems to us to be the most important point, every new enterprise that wants to keep pace with the gigantic enterprises that have arisen on the basis of the process of concentration would produce such an enormous quantity of surplus goods that it could only dispose of them either by being able to sell them profitably as a result of an enormous increase in demand, or by immediately forcing down prices to a level that would be unprofitable both for itself and for the monopoly combines. In England, unlike other countries where protective tariffs facilitate the formation of cartels, monopolist. In England, unlike other countries where protective tariffs facilitate the formation of cartels, monopolist alliances of entrepreneurs, cartels, and trusts arise in the majority of cases only when the number of competing enterprises is reduced to a couple of dozen. So, here the influence of the concentration movement on the formation of large industrial monopolies in a whole sphere of industry stands out with crystal clarity. 50 years ago, when Marx was writing Capital, free competition appeared to most economists to be a natural law. Official science tried, by a conspiracy of silence, to kill the works, which, by a theoretical and historical analysis of capitalism, showed that free competition gives rise to the concentration of production, which in turn, at a certain stage of development, leads to monopoly. Today, monopoly has become a fact. The economists are writing mountains of books in which they describe the diverse manifestations of monopoly and continue to declare in chorus that Marxism is refuted. But facts are stubborn things, as the English proverb says, and they have to be reckoned with, whether we like it or not. The facts show that differences between capitalist countries, e.g., in the matter of protection or free trade, only give rise to insignificant variations in the form of monopolies or in the moment of their appearance, and that the rise of monopolies as the result of the concentration of production is a general and fundamental law of the present stage of development of capitalism. For Europe, the time when the new capitalism definitely superseded the old can be established with fair precision. It was the beginning of the 20th century. In one of the latest compilations on the history of the formation of monopolies, we read, a few isolated examples of capitalist monopoly could be cited from the period preceding 1860. In these could be discerned the embryo of forms that are common today. but all this undoubtedly represents prehistory. The real beginning of modern monopoly goes back at the earliest to the 60s. The first important period of development of monopoly commenced with the International Industrial Depression of the 70s and lasted until the beginning of the 90s. If we examine the question on a European scale, we will find that the development of free competition reached its apex in the 60s and 70s. Then it was that England completed the construction of its old-style capitalist organization. In Germany, this organization had entered into a fierce struggle with handicraft and domestic industry and had begun to create for itself its own forms of existence. The Great Revolutionization commenced with the crash of 1873, or rather, the depression which followed it, and which, with hardly discernible interruptions in the early 80s, and the unusually violent but short-lived boom about 1889, marks 22 years of European economic history. During the short boom of 1889 to 90, the system of cartels was widely resorted to in order to take advantage of the favorable business conditions. An ill-considered policy drove prices still higher than would have been the case otherwise, and nearly all these cartels perished ingloriously in the smash. Another 5-year period of bad trade and low prices followed, but a new spirit reigned in industry. The depression was no longer regarded as something to be taken for granted. It was regarded as nothing more than a pause before another boom. The cartel movement entered its second epoch. Instead of being a transitory phenomenon, the cartels became one of the foundations of economic life. They are winning one field after another, primarily the raw materials industry. At the beginning of the 90s, the cartel system had already acquired in the organization of the Coke Syndicate, on the model of which the Coal Syndicate was later formed, a cartel technique which could hardly be improved. For the first time, the Great Boom at the close of the 19th century and the crisis of 1900 to 03 occurred entirely in the mining and iron industries, at least, under the aegis of the cartels. And while at that time it appeared to be something novel, now the general public takes it for granted that large spheres of economic life have been, as a general rule, systematically removed from the realm of free competition. Thus, the principal stages in the history of monopolies are the following. 1. 1860 to 70, the highest stage. The apex of development of free competition, monopoly is in the barely discernible embryonic stage. 2. After the crisis of 1873, a wide zone of deployment of cartels, but they are still the exception. They are not yet durable, they are still a transitory phenomenon. 3. The boom at the end of the 19th century and the crisis of 1900 to 03. Cartels become one of the foundations of the whole of economic life. Capitalism has been transformed into imperialism. Cartels come to an agreement on the conditions of sale, terms of payment, etc. They divide the markets among themselves. They fix the quantity of goods to be produced. They fix prices. They divide the profits among the various enterprises, etc. The number of cartels in Germany was estimated at about 250 in 1896 and at 385 in 1905, with about 12,000 firms participating. But it is generally recognized that these figures are underestimations. From the statistics of German industry for 1907 we quoted above, it is evident that even 12,000 large enterprises control certainly more than half the steam and electric power used in the country. In the United States, the number of trusts in 1900 was 185, and in 1907, 250. American statistics divide all industrial enterprises into three categories, according to whether they belong to individuals, to private firms, to corporations. These latter in 1904 comprised 23.6%, and in 1909, 25.9%, i.e., more than 1/4 of the total industrial enterprises in the country. These employed in 1904 70.6%, and in 1909 75.6%, i.e., more than 3/4 of the total wage earners. Their output amounted at these two dates to 10,900,000,000 and to 16,300,000,000, i.e., to 73.7% and 79% of the total, respectively. Not infrequently, cartels and trusts concentrate in their hands 7 or 8/10 of the total output of a given branch of industry. The Rhine-Westphalian Coal Syndicate, at its foundation in 1893, controlled 86.7% total coal output of the area. In 1910, it controlled 95.4%. The monopoly so created assures enormous profits and leads to the formation of technical productive units of formidable magnitude. The famous Standard Oil Company in the United States was founded in 1900. It has an authorized capital of 150 million. It issued 100 million common and 106 million preferred stock. From 1900 to 1907, the following dividends were paid on this stock: 48, 48, 45, 44, 36, 40, 40, 40% in the respective years, i.e., in all 367,000. From 1882 to 1907, out of a total net profits to the amount of 889 million, 606 million were distributed in dividends, and the rest went to reserve capital. In 1907, the various works of the United States Steel Corporation employed no less than 210,180 workers and other employees. The largest enterprise in the German mining industry, the Gelsenkirchen Mining Company, employed 1% of the total output of steel in the United States. The output of mineral ore was at 43.9% and 46.3%, respectively. The report of the American Government Commission on Trusts states, the superiority of the trust over competitors is due to the magnitude of its enterprises and their excellent technical equipment. Since its inception, the Tobacco Trust has devoted all its efforts to the substitution of mechanical for manual labor on an extensive scale. With this end in view, it bought up all patents that had anything to do with the manufacture of tobacco and spent enormous sums for this purpose. Many of these patents at first proved to be of no use and had to be modified by the engineers employed by the trust. At the end of 1906, two subsidiary companies were formed solely to acquire patents. With the same object in view, the trust built its own foundries, machine shops, and repair shops. One of these establishments, that in Brooklyn, employs on the average 300 workers. Here, experiments are carried out on inventions concerning the manufacture of cigarettes, cheroots, snuff, tinfoil for packing, boxes, etc. Here also, inventions are perfected. Other trusts also employ so-called developing engineers, whose business it is to devise new methods of production and to test technical improvements. The United States Steel Corporation grants big bonuses to its workers and engineers for inventions suitable for raising technical efficiency and for reducing cost of production. In German large-scale industry, e.g., in the chemical industry, which has developed so enormously during these last few decades, the promotion of technical improvement is organized in the same way. By 1908, the process of concentration of production had already given rise to two main groups which, in their way, are in the nature of monopolies. First, these groups represented dual alliances of two pairs of big factories, each having a capital of from 20 to 21 million. Well, not working again. Okay, sweet. So I just had another little bit of technical difficulty there, but I just kept reading without noticing. Thankfully, I was able to see where I left off. So I'll just start that sentence again. Or maybe it would just be better to start the page again. Oh. In German large-scale industry, e.g., in the chemical industry, which has developed so enormously during these last few decades, the promotion of technical improvement is organized in the same way. By 1908, the process of concentration of production had already given rise to two main groups which, in their way, were in the nature of monopolies. First, these groups represented dual alliances of two pairs of big factories, each having a capital of from 20 to 21 million marks. On the one hand, the former Meister factory at Hochst and the Casella factory at Frankfurt on Main, and on the other hand, the aniline and soda factory at Ludwigshafen and the former Bayer factory at Elberfeld. In 1905, one of these groups, and in 1908, the other group, each concluded a separate agreement with yet another. Just nearly did it again. And in 1908, the other group, each concluded a separate agreement with yet another. Okay. A separate agreement with yet another big factory. The result was the formation of two triple alliances, each with a capital of from 40 to 50 million marks. And these alliances began to come close to one another to reach an understanding about prices, etc. Competition has become transformed into monopoly. The result is immense progress in the socialization of production. In particular, the process of technical invention and improvement becomes socialized. This is no longer the old type free competition between manufacturers, scattered and out of touch with one another and producing for an unknown market. Concentration has reached the point at which it is possible to make an approximate estimate of all sources of raw materials, for example, the iron ore deposits of a country, and even, as we shall see, of several countries of the whole world. Not only are such estimates made, but these sources are captured by gigantic monopolist combines. An approximate estimate of the capacity of markets is also made, and the combines divide them up amongst themselves by agreement. Skilled labor is monopolized. The best engineers are engaged. The means of transport are captured. Railways in America, shipping companies in Europe and America. Capitalism, in its imperialist stage, arrives at the threshold of the most complete socialization of production. In spite of themselves, the capitalists are dragged, as it were, into a new social order. A transitional social order from complete free competition to complete socialization. Production becomes social, appropriation remains private. The social means of production remain the private property of a few. The general framework of formally recognized free competition remains, but the yoke of a few monopolists on the rest of the population becomes 100 times heavier, more burdensome, and intolerable. The German economist Kästner has written a book especially on the subject of the struggle between the cartels and outsiders, i.e., enterprises outside the cartels. He entitled his work Compulsory Organization, although, in order to present capitalism in its true light, he should have given it the title Compulsory Submission to Monopolist Combines. This book is edifying, if only for the list it gives of the modern and civilized methods that monopolist combines resort to in their striving towards organization. They are as follows. 1. Stopping supplies of raw materials, one of the most important methods of compelling adherence to the cartel. 2. Stopping the supply of labor by means of alliances, i.e., agreements between the employers and the trade unions by which the latter permit their members to work only in cartelized enterprises. 3. Cutting off deliveries. 4. Closing of trade outlets. 5. Agreements with the buyers by which the latter undertake to trade only with the cartels. 6. Systematic price cutting to ruin outside firms, i.e., those which refuse to submit to the monopolists. Millions are spent in order to sell goods for a certain time below their cost price. There were instances when the price of benzene was thus lowered from 40 to 22 marks, i.e., reduced by half. 7. Stopping credits. 8. Boycott. This is no longer competition between small and large-scale industry, or between technically developed and backward enterprises. We see here the monopolies throttling those which do not submit to them, to their yoke, to their dictation. This is how this process is reflected in the mind of a bourgeois economist. Even in the purely economic sphere, writes Kästner, a certain change is taking place from commercial activity, in the old sense of the word, towards organizational speculative activity. The greatest success no longer goes to the merchant whose technical and commercial experience enables him best of all to understand the needs of the buyer and who is able to discover and effectively awake a latent demand. It goes to the speculative genius who knows how to estimate even only to sense in advance the organizational development and the possibilities of connections between individual enterprises and the banks. Translated into ordinary human language, this means that the development of capitalism has arrived at a stage when, although commodity production still reigns and continues to be regarded as the basis of economic life, it has in reality been undermined, and the big profits go to the geniuses of financial manipulation. At the basis of these swindles and manipulations lies socialized production, but the immense progress of humanity which achieved this socialization goes to benefit the speculators. We shall see later how, on these grounds, reactionary, petty bourgeois critics of capitalist imperialism dream of going back to free, peaceful, and honest competition. That still happens today. I mean, you have people who take this really idealistic approach. It's like, oh, it's not real capitalism, it's just crony capitalism. We just have to go backwards. It's like there's no going backwards. You don't go backwards. History marches on. History marches on. Oh, so I guess what? Well, I thought it was about to go off then. But yeah, history marches on. You cannot go backwards. Things do eventually monopolize. They turn into cartels. You can't just like you can be as idealistic as you want to. It's like, oh, let's break them up. It's like they have the money to control the government. You cannot just go backwards like that. You have to move forward. And what is forward? That's the question. The prolonged raising of prices which results from the formation of cartels, says Kessner, has hitherto been observed only in relation to the most important means of production, particularly coal, iron, and potassium, but has never been observed for any length of time in relation to manufactured goods. Similarly, the increase in profits resulting from that has been limited only to the industries which produce means of production. To this observation, we must add that the raw materials industry not only has secured advantages from the cartel formation in regard to the growth of income and profitableness to the detriment of the finished goods industry, but that it has secured also a dominating position over the latter, which did not exist under free competition. The words which we have italicized, dominating position, reveal the essence of the case which the bourgeois economists admit so rarely and unwillingly, and which the modern defenders of opportunism, led by Karkowski, so zealously try to evade and brush aside. Domination, and violence that is associated with it. Such are the relationships that are most typical of the latest phase of capitalist development. This is what must inevitably result, and has resulted, from the formation of all-powerful economic monopolies. We will give one more example of the methods employed by the cartels. It is particularly easy for cartels and monopolies to arise when it is possible to capture all the sources of raw materials, or at least the most important of them. It would be wrong, however, to assume that monopolies do not arise in other industries in which it is impossible to corner the sources of raw materials. The cement industry, for instance, can find its raw materials everywhere. Yet in Germany, it is strongly cartelized. The cement manufacturers have formed regional syndicates, South German, Rhine-Westphalian, etc. The prices fixed are monopoly prices, 230 to 280 marks a carload, at a cost price of 180 marks. The enterprises pay a dividend of 12% to 16%. And let us not forget that the geniuses of modern speculation know how to pocket big profits besides those they draw by way of dividends. Now, in order to prevent competition in such a profitable industry, the monopolists resort to sundry stratagems. For example, they spread disquieting rumors about the situation in their industry. Anonymous warnings are published in the newspapers, like the following. Investors, don't place your capital in the cement industry. They buy up outsiders, those outside the syndicates, and pay them indemnities of 60,000, 80,000, and even 150,000. Monopoly everywhere hews a path for itself without scruple as to the means, from modestly buying off competitors to the American device of employing dynamite against them. The statement that cartels can abolish crises is a fable spread by bourgeois economists who at all costs desire to place capitalism in a favorable light. On the contrary, when monopoly appears in certain branches of industry, it increases and intensifies the anarchy inherent in capitalist production as a whole. The disparity between the development of agriculture and that of industry, which is characteristic of capitalism, is increased. The privileged position of the most highly cartelized industry, so-called heavy industry, especially coal and iron, causes a still greater lack of concerted organization in other branches of production, as Jadels, the author of one of the best works on the relationship of the German big banks to industry, put it. The more developed an economic system is, Sleeve, one of the most unblushing apologists of capitalism, the more it resorts to risky enterprises or enterprises abroad, to those which need a great deal of time to develop, or finally to those which are only of local importance. The increased risk is connected in the long run with the prodigious increase of capital, which overflows the brim, as it were, flows abroad, etc. At the same time, the extremely rapid rate of technical progress gives rise more and more to disturbances in the coordination between the various spheres of national economy, to anarchy and crisis. Leifman is obliged to admit that, in all probability, mankind will see further important technical revolutions in the near future, which will also affect the organization of the economic system. For example, electricity and aviation. As a general rule, in such periods of radical economic change, speculation develops on a large scale. Crises of every kind, economic crises more frequently, not only these, in their turn, increase very considerably the tendency towards concentration and monopoly. In this connection, the following reflections of Jadels on the significance of the crisis of 1900, which, as we have already seen, marked the turning point in the history of modern monopoly, are exceedingly instructive. Side by side with giant plants in the basic industries, the crisis of 1900 found many plants organized lines that today would be considered obsolete. The pure, non-combined plants, which had arisen on the crest of the industrial boom. The fall in prices and the falling off in demand these pure enterprises into a precarious position, which did not affect the big combined enterprises at all, or only affected them for a very short time. As a consequence of this, the crisis of 1900 resulted in a far greater concentration of industry than former crises, like that of 1873. The latter crisis also produced a sort of selection of the best equipped enterprises, but owing to the level of technical development at that time, this selection could not place the firms which successfully emerged from the crisis in a position of monopoly. Such a durable monopoly exists to a high degree in the gigantic enterprises of the modern iron and steel and electrical industries, and to a lesser degree in the engineering industry and certain metal, transport, and other branches in consequence of their complicated technique, their extensive organization, and the magnitude of their capital. Monopoly. This is the last word in the latest phase of capitalist development. But we shall only have a very insufficient, incomplete, and poor notion of the real power and the significance of modern monopolies if we do not take into consideration the part played by the banks. I am going to finish the stream off here now. Just I don't want to be screwing around if the thing cuts out again. I will need to sort that out. So yeah, I'll have to try and figure that out before Thursday, hopefully. But I will say this: on Thursday, I will continue playing Freedom Planet for the gaming stream, starting Carol's campaign. I will now be running a second lot of reading streams on Saturday nights. Same time, 6:30, 7th, obviously is pushed back. And I will be doing, so the Tuesdays, starting with this book that I've just been reading, will be a unit aptly named on imperialism, with a few books to come afterwards, namely Clinton Fernandez's Sub-Imperial Power, Australia in the International Arena, Super Imperialism, The Economic Strategy of American Empire by Michael Hudson, and then The Anglo-American Establishment by Carol Quigley. On Saturdays, for the time being, we're working on a unit that I have called Israel, Palestine, and the Zionist Problem. And that will start with this book, The Jewish Question, A Marxist Interpretation by Abram Leon. So that would be an interesting book to read. So yeah, we will see that on Saturday. I'll begin reading that, and then after that, I think after that it's like 3 books by Elon Puppet, and then I'll sort of get into other stuff after that. So yeah, I'm just gonna finish it off for today. I will try and sort out the Wi-Fi. So I've got Starlink, as much as I hate giving that Nazi money. I have Starlink, and there's just obstructions. I moved into a new place. As you probably see here, it looks a bit different from my usual backdrop. Yeah, I moved into a new place. I have a feeling there's trees above there, so it's a bit difficult to get that working fine. So I may have to trim back some of those branches, perhaps. But yeah. So I will see you guys on Thursday for the gaming stream, or on Saturday for this book. Otherwise, next Tuesday we will continue Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Have a good night or morning, viewer. I'll catch you next time.